almost everything that we know about the life and the teaching of Jesus Christ comes from the New Testament. But some skeptics claim that we can't trust the text of the New Testament. They claim the New Testament that we have now isn't the original text, but that it's been altered by scribes. That's a claim that the text was sometimes changed just by careless copying, but more importantly, that often it was changed by scribes deliberately so that they could change the teaching of the Bible to fit that of the mainstream church. So basically they're saying that the text that we have now doesn't match the original teaching of Jesus or the apostles, but that instead it teaches what the church wanted it to teach much later on. Now, the evidence is actually completely against that. The evidence doesn't support that claim at all. It supports the idea that the Bible was in fact accurately copied, and what we have now is very much the teaching that the apostles put into it when they first wrote it. Let's think about the timescale of possible changes. So the idea is Jesus is crucified and raised from the dead somewhere around 30 AD or possibly 33 AD. The narrative fits either. The New Testament itself then is completed a few decades later. The evidence is that it's actually completed before 70 AD, with most of it completed by the mid-60s of the Common Era. Some people put the Revelation a bit later than that, but basically that's the sort of time that the New Testament is written. You then have a period when the church changes, where it adopts philosophy from Greek philosophy, uses that to change the way that its beliefs are developed, and in the end we get a teaching of the church which is quite different from that of the apostles. And this comes to a head really in the early 4th century, when Constantine becomes Emperor of Rome, and he decides to base stuff on Christianity. He's going to base his general building of the empire around this as an ideology, try and unify it, and he calls the Council of Nicaea in 325, where he tries to unify the teaching of the church. But the church teaching from Nicaea is quite a lot different from the teaching of the apostles in the 1st century AD, which is reflected in the New Testament. Now, there's two theories then as to how that affects the New Testament. And the first theory, the one that's becoming quite common at the moment, is that the church changed the text of the New Testament as it adopted this pagan idea. So in the 2nd century, it starts to alter the text of the New Testament, and it carries on doing that into the 4th century. So that's the early corruption theory, which is becoming more popular at the moment. There's an older theory, which is that, well, yes, the text of the New Testament was pretty much fixed in the first 3 centuries, say, after Christianity. But after that, the church was part of the Roman state, and gradually things changed to try and fit it in with the philosophies of the church and the ideas of the church. Neither of those is actually correct. You show that the evidence, when you look at it, says something completely different. It says that the text of the New Testament is not effectively changed from the time it was written. Think about the evidence. Well, the biggest evidence is the evidence of the manuscripts of the New Testament, and that there are huge numbers of manuscripts available, far more than the number for any other ancient book. So there's a list there, 5,800 Greek manuscripts when the survey that I'm reporting now was carried out. In fact, there are now heading for 6,000 manuscripts discovered. The number's gone up. It's new manuscripts being discovered every year, and the number is increasing quite rapidly. But besides the Greek manuscripts that we have, there are translations of the original Greek text into various other ancient languages. So we've got a lot of translations into Latin, some of them made very early on. There's evidence of translations as early as the 1st century. Certainly there were 2nd century translations into Latin, several differing translations, and in the end of the 4th century there's an official Latin translation known as the Vulgate, which was made. There are copies of many of these old translations and of the Vulgate, 10,000 altogether Latin manuscripts around, and you can translate the Latin back into Greek and see what the original Greek text must have been. And so the text we get from Latin is not very different from the text that we get from the Greek, give or take the odd problems for a translator. And we get the same thing in Coptic, and then there are other things, Old Slavonic, Syriac, Ethiopic, lots and lots of other ancient languages. Altogether, we've got 24,000 different manuscripts to go at when we're trying to work out what the text of the New Testament is. Fortunately, they're pretty much of a muchness. We don't have a really big struggle to work out what the original text actually was, although if you want to compare fine detail of the copying, you have to start using computer methods nowadays and proper statistics if you want to get the two together. What I've got there is a sort of bar chart that shows the various different translations by the dates. So the first set there, that's 2nd century, we've got virtually nothing. 2nd century there, we've got a few papyri, mostly fragments, but towards the end of it, we're getting whole books. Gradually, parchment takes over from papyrus. Parchment's expensive, so the church has to have some money behind it. Once it's got the state behind it, everything goes onto parchment till they invent paper. You get unsealed manuscripts, which are uppercase only and have no gaps between the words. You get minuscules, they have upper and lowercase gaps between the words, more modern kind of script, which at the time was found easier to read. And we get lectionaries, we get unsealed and minuscule lectionaries. A lectionary is a Bible. It's written in a different order. The various different churches would have a reading plan. So you would read the following chapters. You'd read something from the Old Testament. You'd read a psalm. You'd read something from a gospel. You'd read a letter. And you'd read those 4 portions on each day. And rather than have a set of tables and then try and thumb through a book when there's no chapters and verses, to find the relevant bit to read for that day, you'd have that day's readings written out. You've got the whole Bible written out, but not written out in the usual order, written out in the order that it would be read in a particular monastery. So those are the 2nd set of unseals and minuscules. If you put that in a sort of cumulative curve, so you can see how many manuscripts we've got available, 16th century and earlier, well, got about 5,800 now, maybe 5,900. When, again, I got the figures for this, they haven't discovered quite so many. And gradually, as you go further back, the number of manuscripts that's available gets less. So the thing that everyone says is that, well, 90% of the manuscripts available are later than the 9th century. That's true, but it's put in a way that's a bit misleading. It sounds, well, nearly anything is quite late. Sort of. What it does mean is that if 90% are later than the 9th century, then 10% are earlier than the 10th century. In fact, there's the 9th century one. It is about 10% of the manuscripts. But if you think how many manuscripts you've got, 10% of a lot of manuscripts is still a lot of manuscripts. That's the thing that people tend to forget. And in fact, if you count them up, we have 517 Greek manuscripts from this early period, and we have another almost 2,000 manuscripts of translations into ancient languages. Exact number I'm not certain of. The catalogues are sometimes not very precise about that, but we've got at least 1,800 of them, maybe near 1,900. So there's plenty to go at. just looking at these old manuscripts, we've still got more than for any other ancient writing. Other writings, we don't worry about the text. We shouldn't be worrying about the text of the New Testament either. And it's not that they're just the odd fragment. We're talking about some substantial manuscripts. This one is the Codex Sinaiticus. That one, it's a manuscript on parchment. It contains most of the Bible, contains the whole of the New Testament, and it was copied probably in the reign of Constantine, probably something that was commissioned by him or by his advisors, and it's pretty much a complete New Testament. That one's the Codex Vaticanus again, pretty much complete. It's missing out the pastoral epistles for some reason, but nevertheless, the rest of it is more or less complete. That's just slightly before Codex Sinaiticus. We have these big manuscripts, and we have them from the 4th century onwards, these big uppercase letter uncial manuscripts on parchment. So the important point is that there are huge numbers of witnesses, some of them early, some of them are later copies of earlier witnesses. But there are such a large number of them that you can do all sorts of analysis to find out just how well we understand how good the text is. And the point is, there is not much variation. So lots of witnesses, hardly any variation. So there we go. We've got these manuscripts. We can be pretty certain that the text of the New Testament we have now is very much the same as it was in these great codices of the 4th century. So what about before then? Was there alteration before that time? Well, let's think about the evidence of early transmission. Well, there's the timeline again. New Testament completed in the mid to late 60s AD, and the Council of Nicaea, these big manuscripts, comes up sort of around 330, 340, that sort of time, and we're pretty certain that we've got the same text we had then. Well, we've got evidence from before that time. We've got various papyri, and while the very earliest papyri are just fragments, we do have some substantial papyri. This one's P66, it's the Gospel of John. Almost complete, it's a couple of pages missing, and you can possibly see it's a bit worn away at the corners, but nonetheless there's enough to show that the text is the same as the modern text. There's another one that's part of Luke, part of John. This one's the letters of Paul, and we have pretty much the whole of the New Testament from the middle of the 3rd century. These are slightly earlier ones. These are beginning of the 3rd century, even the end of the 2nd century. So from 180 AD, we're getting these big papyri. There are fragments even earlier than that, but we're getting the text of the New Testament, at least a single manuscript, often several manuscripts, from much before the time of the Council of Nicaea. And it's the same as it is in the modern version or in one of the 4th century translations. Not only that, we've got quotations. Ancient writers often wrote about the New Testament, so-called church fathers. They wrote commentaries, they wrote arguments based on the Bible, and they quoted the New Testament, sometimes over and over again if it's a popular bit, sometimes only once. But we've got every verse of the New Testament, apart from 15, quoted by a writer writing before the time of the Council of Nicaea. People say you could reconstruct the New Testament from it. Well, it would be difficult because of getting everything in the right order. But apart from that, yeah, we've got the text. It's there in quotations as well. And the quotations are pretty much the same as the text we've got now. Not always exactly, because sometimes the writer is quoting from memory and he's not quite certain, or he's quoting a translation. But nonetheless, we've got enough to know that the text we have is the same as the text that they had there. That's the earliest person that does citations of the New Testament, Clement of Rome. He's writing in 96 AD. Follow that up with people like Ignatius of Antioch, writing about 115, Polycarp, and various apocryphal things like the Epistle of Barnabas. These are quoting from the New Testament, they're quoting it accurately, and they're quoting it early. There's no major variation that they made that then passed on into a later witness to the text of the New Testament. Modern text of the New Testament hasn't been altered by that. So, has the presentation so far been convincing? Has it shown the reliability of the text of the New Testament? Let us know what you think in the comments, because there's other evidence as well. Besides the manuscript evidence that shows the actual text being copied, we can look at the New Testament and say, is it reliable? And we get even small details. So archaeologists, for example, dig things up. If you look in the Gospel of John, for example, chapter 2, it talks about a miracle in Cana of Galilee where Jesus turns water into wine, and it describes the water jars there. It says there were 6 stone water jars there for the Jewish rites of purification, each one holding 20 or 30 gallons. So we got this little detail that the jars were made of stone. Now, normally water jars be made of earthenware, but archaeologists have discovered that it was very common to have water jars made of stone, much more expensive, but that's what they had in Judea and in Galilee at the time of Jesus. Nowhere else, no other time. So if there'd been poor copying, or if people had deliberately altered the text, that's the sort of detail that would have vanished quite quickly because it would have been unknown to the people who were making the copies. Another one, the idea of an undesigned coincidence. What you get here is details in one part of the New Testament, or in one part of the Bible, you get it all over the Bible, which match up with other insignificant details elsewhere, and there's no apparent connection between the two of them. So these are places where you wouldn't expect to see a correspondence, but the correspondence is there, hidden away. So an example in Matthew chapter 14, we've got Herod the Antipas. It says, at that time, Herod the Tetrarch heard about the fame of Jesus, and he said to his servants, this is John the Baptist, who's been raised from the dead. Right, so why is Herod discussing things with his servants? He's a king. The servants are way below him in the social scale, and particularly far below him at the time of Jesus. And why would Herod talk to his servants about Jesus? Well, there's a reason for that. And if you go totally different gospel and something that's not connected at all to it, you find an account of Jesus going on a preaching trip in Galilee. So it's in Luke chapter 8, and he says, soon afterward, he went on through the cities and villages, proclaiming and bringing the good news of the kingdom of God, and the 12 were with him. Also, some women who had been healed of evil spirits and infirmity, Mary called Magdalene, from whom 7 demons had gone out, and Joanna, the wife of Chuza, Herald's household manager, Aunt Susanna, and many others. So among the women that are going around with Jesus, we've got Joanna, the wife of Chuza, and Chuza is Herod's steward, his household manager, is one of Herod's servants, as a chief servant. And so if Herod wants to know about Jesus, wants to discuss Jesus, someone who's informed about him, who's more informed than one of Herod's servants whose wife travels around with Jesus? And so Herod's got a reason to talk to his disciples, his servants. So it's a little tiny detail, but it matches up. And the New Testament is absolutely plumb full of little tiny details like that match up with other tiny details in a very non-obvious kind of way. Something, again, that would rapidly be lost if the copying was done badly or if people deliberately altered the text. And another example, the language. The church spoke Greek, later on it spoke Latin. It didn't speak Hebrew or Aramaic. But when we look at the sayings of Jesus, he obviously spoke Greek, but he also spoke Aramaic. And you get things like this. So Matthew chapter 23 this time, he talks about the Pharisees as blind guides who strain out a gnat and swallow a camel. And that's a nice picture. You can remember that one. But it's even more memorable if you do it in Aramaic, because in Aramaic, the word for a camel is gamla, and the word for small fly is camlus, spelled with a Q. And he's putting a play on words there, something which only discovered in the 1970s, perhaps. People started translating the New Testament back into Aramaic and finding suddenly certain sayings stick out as having word plays in and as having meter and rhyme in Aramaic that they didn't have in Greek. If you're going to make up a saying of Jesus in a Greek-speaking church for Greek-speaking readers, you're not going to make something up that comes out of Aramaic. If you're going to alter the text in a random sort of way, well, random for Aramaic, it's been systematic for new teaching, you're going to end up with a Greek linguistic background, not an Aramaic linguistic background. And the linguistic background being Aramaic shows that the copying was done accurately. So all these tests that show the reliability of the New Testament, that it's a reliable record of what was said by Jesus, what was done by Jesus, they're carried out not using some different text from the way past, but using the modern text of the New Testament. What they're showing is that the modern text of the New Testament is a reliable picture of the sayings and doings of Jesus, and that means it hasn't been altered. Final point. The theory is that the scribes decided to change the Bible so that it would fit the teachings of the church. Well, if that was their intention, they made a really bad job of it. It was an absolute disaster because the New Testament doesn't match the official teachings of the church. If you take the mainstream churches of the day, if you take the mainstream churches now, the New Testament teaches something which isn't particularly what the churches say. Certain things like the resurrection, yeah, that's there. Things like the doctrine of the Trinity, not in the New Testament. When you die, according to the New Testament, you're not going to heaven. The New Testament teaches what the apostles taught and not what the church teaches. And so things haven't matched up. So there isn't this thing about the scribes changing it. Let's summarize what we've seen now. First of all, we saw there are lots and lots of witnesses to the text of the New Testament. There are manuscripts, there are citations, and they show that the text of the New Testament is reliable. You can see that these early witnesses, both the manuscript ones and the quotations, are showing us that the church didn't change early either. So there are lots of modern, more recent witnesses. There are lots of very early witnesses too. The text didn't change through the first few centuries either. And we saw that the tests where we look to see whether the New Testament is reliable or not, they show us that the modern text is reliable, and so the modern text must match the text that was reliably put together by the apostles following the teaching of Jesus. So the modern text that we've got now is reliable. That's the important thing. It's up to us to read it and to understand it. Well, I hope you enjoyed that. If you did, if you liked it, there's a button that YouTube has conveniently put there. You can click that button and show how much you did like it. You can look at our website, and there are plenty of other videos on this channel, and particularly there's a longer one about the text of the New Testament, which you might want to look at. It goes through the witnesses in rather more detail than I have here. And don't forget to subscribe.